Hello and welcome to the video. In this video we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges flying in winter conditions. If you're in the Northern Hemisphere and you've joined the radio controlled hobby, particularly flying wings, quads, planes and FPV kit in this year, you will be about to experience your first winter of radio controlled flying. Now, you can absolutely fly in the colder weather. In fact, the colder weather can be a great time to fly. You're going to get completely different views of the countryside if you're doing FPV. Snow and frost-covered landscapes are fantastic to look at, particularly with the low sun if you're using a wide dynamic range camera. And you tend to get very calm, clear, bright days in winter as well. So it can give you an awful lot of really good flying weather. It can give you a lot of terrible flying weather too, but there will be days when you will be tempted to put everything in your backpack, go to the local field and try it in the beautiful, bright, clear sky. There are a couple of things that you need to be aware of though, and in this video we're going to talk about those. And these are all based on my experiences for the first 3 or 4 winters that I went through with the radio controlled hobby, and some of it is from bitter experience, and I'm going to tell a couple of stories as we go through this. So what I'm going to do is put up a couple of slides and we'll talk through each of them, and I'll just bring some things to life. I'll talk about some of the key things to keep in mind those first couple of times you're going out to the field. Do remember, of course, that whenever you go out in the winter, there's going to be a lot more mud around and a lot more moisture on the grass. And whenever you land, it's going to get all over the model. So I would always recommend sticking a towel in the bottom of the bag that you can wipe everything down with. Be careful, particularly with multi-rotors. If they come down, they have a bit of a nasty landing, whereas in the summertime they'll just bounce around. You'll tend to find that they'll try and bury themselves into mud. They like to try and dig for the other side of the planet. And because a lot of the multi-rotors these days have lots of open spaces for cooling, it also lets all the grit and rubbish get inside as well. And again, that's one of those things that sometimes it can be better to let the motor dry out completely and use a soft brush to try and clear as much of that debris out of the motor as possible. I always flush the bearings. If the bearings are not sealed in the motor, you can occasionally find after a crash, as you turn the motor by hand, it feels slightly gritty. If you have grit in your bearings, then you need to flush them with oil. The trick that I tend to use, I have a little foldable piece of foam board that's covered in tape to try and make it water resistant. I tend to try and land and take off from that just to stop all of that rubbish getting into the motor and inside the model. Remember to store your models in a dry place whenever you get home, and always remove the batteries. It just helps if any moisture has got somewhere where it shouldn't have got, for that to dry out. So I would try and keep models, if you've been flying them inside the house for a day or two, in the central heating, so that any moisture that's maybe got inside the GPS unit or got inside the flight controller is going to evaporate safely. LiPo batteries do not like the cold. They will not perform as well in very cold conditions. And what that means is that you'll get substantially less flight time and a little bit less power out of the packs than you may be used to when you were flying in the summertime as well. I always try and drop my timers on the radio by about 15-20%, because what's happening inside the battery is converting that chemical energy into electrical energy, and that's what happens the other way around when you charge it. The other thing to think about is make sure that if you're not using any of the batteries over the winter, don't leave them for months at a time at full charge. Most battery chargers these days will allow you to set them to what's called a storage charge, which is usually 3.8 volts a cell, and the very latest batteries, things like the BatGo batteries, the smart batteries, will actually auto discharge after about 10 days down to that safe level as well. So before you put your batteries away, maybe for a model that you don't intend to fly till spring comes around, just double check that all the batteries are a storage charge, and if they're not, make sure they are. Other quick tip about LiPo batteries is they tend to get a little bit warm in operation, and when you take them off the model, they can also act as very useful hand warmers. If you just kind of hold them in your hands, it can get the circulation back into the tips of your fingers. Couple of tips for line of sight flying. I would always add LEDs to the model for orientation. You tend to find in the summer you use LEDs less, and to be honest, once you're about 30-40 feet away, you struggle to see even the brightest LEDs in bright sunlight. In these more overcast, darker conditions, having LEDs on the model can be very useful. Make sure that you don't take it too far out. The weather can change quickly in winter. I'm not talking about anything that any of us don't know. Be prepared to land the craft if the weather changes quickly. If it's suddenly fine, then it starts to suddenly get quite dark and cloud over and it looks like there's rain coming. Just keep an eye on that weather and make sure that you have easy access to get the model down and get to safety before the heavens open. And remember that the denser, colder air will make the model perform differently. So be prepared for that. The colder air is actually more dense, so the flight characteristics of the model can be a little bit different too. A couple of tips for FPV flying. Again, add LEDs to the model for orientation support. If a bit of water gets into your FPV equipment and something does go wrong, then you want to be able to fly it home safely. The goggles and the camera can steam up. The big tip, and the thing that I got wrong the very first time I tried to FPV in the winter, was that I put all the equipment in the boot when I went to the field, the nice cold boot of the car, or trunk if you're in America. Let everything get nice and cold. Then the lenses inside the goggles and also the lens on the camera were nice and cold, and they immediately started to condense out all of the horrible moisture that was around. So it made viewing very difficult. Keep the cameras, keep your goggles in the car with you, keep them inside your jacket. That way the lenses will always be warm. Most of the modern goggles have a demisting fan. Make sure you've got that turned on as well, but even that won't save you. If the lenses are cold, the condensation from your eyes will just settle out onto the lenses and you'll be in trouble really quickly. In winter, it's also potentially worthwhile thinking about moving away from goggles and using some kind of FPV screen as well. In the lower light conditions, they're much easier to see. They don't steam up. And I find that a screen is a nicer FPV experience in winter, unless you've got goggles with the demisting fan and all the gadgets on to keep them nice and clear for you. Last thing to think about is the lower sun. As you're flying around, the sun isn't going to be above you, it's going to potentially be in the line of sight of the camera, and make sure that you're using a camera with a nice wide dynamic range. The modern Runcam and Foxeer cameras all have very wide dynamic range and they can cope with it great. But if you're using a cheap and cheerful camera or one of the little cameras that tend to come on the indoor style flyers, if you do face the sun, you lose all of the detail in the ground as it exposes for that very bright point of light. Last one then to talk about is you, the pilot. Do remember you've got to be standing still for 10-12 minutes at a time, and you're going to be concentrating very hard on whatever it is you're doing. While you're doing that, your feet are going to get very cold, your hands potentially are going to get very cold, and anything else like your ears and nose is too. Make sure you're wrapping up warm. Take a couple of extra layers of clothes. You might be nice and warm when you're moving around, but it's amazing how quickly the cold can leach out of your skin. If your fingers get too cold, they'll start to get stiff, and that will remove some of the abilities for that fine control that you might need to control whatever model that you're flying. Also remember, the cold can affect your ability to concentrate as well. You might suddenly realise that your ears are getting quite painful because you've been stood there for a while and they're not covered up, and then once you've noticed that, then you tend to find that half of your brain is thinking about that rather than all your concentration going into flying. So do make sure that you're wrapping up, taking a little bit of extra time. I tend to take a flask of something hot as well, and if you're getting too cold, then take a break, get back in the car, and make sure that when you're not flying, pop your gloves back on and keep your fingers nice and warm. So hopefully that helps those of you that are coming into your first radio controlled winter flying experience. I'm sure a lot of the stuff that I've covered is kind of common sense, but it's amazing how often I hear from pilots, and it's amazing how often I have made mistakes that was due to not thinking enough about a couple of these points we've covered. Thank you for taking the time to watch that video, and particularly for watching right to the very end. We try and release a video on Tuesday and Friday, and sometimes we'll release 1 or 2 extra ones in a week as well. All of the videos on the channel are organised into easy to use playlists, so do have a look in there, because if you're interested in a subject, we organise all the videos on that subject so you can find them easily all together in one place. If you like what we're doing, then please like and subscribe and tell others about the channel so they can come and join as well. We're available in all of the usual social media places, particularly in places like Instagram, Twitter, and we also share all of our 3D designs on Thingiverse.